Hello everyone and welcome to the 10th installment of Black Cat Theology. This is Dr. Peter Dillard. Currently we are in the process of developing what I have called a theology of Gelassenheit, a certain theological option that is at least suggested by some of Martin Heidegger's later writings. Recall that Gelassenheit is the German word for letting be, and the central feature of this Gelassenheit theological option is that our fundamental experience of divinity, at least ideally, is one of a kind of energized tranquility. It's a kind of dwelling in intimacy with divinity, where this dwelling is very peaceful or very tranquil on the one hand, but it also is charged. It has a certain kind of energetic component in it. Now, we've been discussing this, and last time we were looking at some weaknesses and some strengths of this theological option. One of the principal drawbacks or weaknesses of it is that it threatens to make our experience of divinity collapse into a kind of complacency, a kind of blandness or boredom. Yes, there's this energy that's implicit in the Gelassenheit experience, but it still remains unclear how that prevents or forestalls the danger that we will sort of lapse into a kind of theological quiescence. Remember also that the theological option of Gelassenheit that we are developing is one that we, given the particular commitments that I and other people have, are trying to relate to the Christian faith. And so another objective, or another, weakness at least, that we need to overcome as we develop this theological option is that we need to explain more clearly how it relates to core doctrines of the Christian faith, like the incarnation, the Trinity, the atonement, and so forth. Now, last time we discovered a potentially very valuable resource that we might use in our project of developing this Gelassenheit theological option. And in particular, we looked to the writings of Rudolf Otto, the great Marburg theologian. And in particular, we look to Otto's work, The Holy, his phenomenology of the holy. Remember that Otto is very much influenced by the broad phenomenological framework of Edmund Husserl, the German philosopher. And Otto is very interested in depicting or describing our experience of the holy. What is it that we experience when we seem to be in the presence of something holy, mysterious, something divine? So, following this basic Husserlian framework, Otto distinguishes between two major poles, if you will, within the experience of the holy. On the one hand, there is what he calls the numinous aspect of this experience, and those are our feelings, our personal experiences, our feelings, our emotions that are evoked in the course of this experience. That corresponds to Husserl's notion of the noesis within a phenomenological or an intentional experience. Now, because the experience is intentional, and in particular because the experience of the holy is intentional, it purports at least to be directed at something outside or beyond us. And so Otto refers to this aspect of the overall experience of the holy as the noumen, the holy object, the holy noumen. That is the purported object of the numinous, or let's say noumenal experience. So the feelings and emotions that we have, this numinous component or pole, are directed, at least purport to be directed at something out there that is evoking or calling forth these emotions, these psychological states from us. And so we have on the way, we have again, the object is in Otto's terminology is the noumen. We saw that there were a couple of features of Otto's phenomenology of the holy that are very attractive, or should be very attractive, to someone who is working within this Heideggerian perspective in this attempt to try to develop a Gelassenheit theology. We saw, for example, that initially at least, Otto doesn't want to bring any presuppositions, any metaphysical or ontological presuppositions to this experience of the holy. And so he compares it to the experience that Jacob had at Bethany when he had this experience or this feeling of the divine presence all around him. And recall that Otto uses the German phrase "es spukt hier," or "it's eerie here," as a sort of initial description of this experience, where, at least grammatically, the structure of that phrase or that expression is similar to our English expression, well, it's raining here, or it's hot there, where the "it" within that linguistic construction doesn't refer to any particular object, or there's not some substance, or there's not some metaphysical entity that's supposed to be picking out. It's just the whole expression is describing and calling our attention to this meteorological condition of it's raining. And similarly, Otto thinks of "es spukt hier," or "it's eerie here," or "it's holy here." In a similar way, at least initially, that is supposed to describe our overall experience of this mysterious holy presence. That fits well with the Gelassenheit theological option that we are seeking to develop, because recall that fundamentally within that theological option, God or the divine or the holy is not supposed to be the same as any particular being or even the notion of being itself. It's something purportedly out there and real, but the Gelassenheit theologian doesn't want to identify that with some specific being or even with being itself, whether we understand being metaphysically as the maximally general characteristic that's common to all and only beings, or maybe we want to understand it non-metaphysically, following later Heidegger, as a kind of event. That was one attractive feature of Otto's phenomenology of the holy. The second one is that when Otto begins to differentiate this experience of the holy a little bit more, and when he begins, remember that again we have the numinous, those are the experiences, the feelings that we may have that purport to be directed at the numen out there. So there's the holy, the numinous aspect of the holy experience, and then there's the noumenal object of it, the intentional object, if you will. Otto proceeds to distinguish two very general features or characteristics of the holy noumen. One of those he calls mysterium tremendens. And this is a kind of, the holy appears to us, the noumen, the holy noumen appears to us as something awful and also a little frightening and something mighty, almost terrible in its aspect. And corresponding to that in us are feelings of being overawed or taken aback. Specifically, Otto goes on to discuss or to describe, differentiate at least three moments within our experience of the mysterium tremendums, the holy noumen under this aspect. It has a kind of awfulness, a kind of overpoweringness, and a kind of energy. It appears to us in that way. And then we have feelings that correspond to that. So that's one of the noumenal attributes that Otto differentiates. The other one is mysterium fascinans. So in this instance, the holy noumen appears to us as something wonderful and something that is desirable, so that the experiences, the numinous experiences that we have corresponding to that, are feelings of being very happy in the presence of this wonderful noumenal object. And also we have a kind of longing to be united with it in the expectation that we will feel a great peace or tranquility. So those are the two noumenal aspects that Otto attributes to the holy as the noumen, the intentional object of the numinous experience. And he summarizes this very nicely in a passage. Let me just read it so that we can have that before us. He says at one point in his book, The Holy, the demonic divine object may appear to the mind an object of horror and dread, but at the same time it is no less something that allures us with a potent charm, and the creature who trembles before it has always at the same time the impulse to turn to it, nay, even to make it somehow its own, so to become united with it. So here we see all of those things coming together. Now, before we can proceed, or before the Gelassenheit theologian can proceed in appropriating Otto's phenomenology of the holy, I mentioned last time that there is a serious challenge that needs to be addressed. And that if we don't overcome this challenge, we will not be able to utilize the very valuable observations that Otto has made. So let me say what that problem is, what that challenge is. And we might describe it as a kind of ontological antinomy. So remember that we've been talking, or sort of assuming up to this point, following Otto, that there is only one holy numen that's the object of the holy numinous experience, and that this holy numen has two major attributes, mysterium tremendans und mysterium fascinans. Now someone might ask, well, why is it that there's only one holy numen here with two numinal attributes? Why isn't it rather the case that we have two holy noumena? One of them has the attribute of mysterium tremendans, and the other holy numen has the contrary or the opposite attribute, numinal attribute, of mysterium fascinans. Why is there only one numen with two attributes as opposed to a pair of ontologically distinct holy noumena, each of which has one of the numinal attributes? Now, that would be a very serious problem, particularly for someone working within the Christian faith tradition, because there aren't two gods. One of them something that's kind of awe-inspiring and a little frightening on the one hand, and the other which is something desirable with which we long to be united. That would be a kind of dualistic polytheism. In fact, it almost sounds like Manichaeanism or Manichaeism. And as many of you may know, and certainly is clear from the history of Christian theology, Manichaeism is a heresy. That's a view that the Christian orthodoxy cannot accept. So the question before us here is, why isn't Otto committed to something like that? Or more cautiously expressed, how can he rule that out? Nothing that he has said within his phenomenology of the holy so far rules out that we have two holy noumena as opposed to one. That would be a serious obstacle for at least a Christian theologian who wants to develop the Gelassenheit option. That would be a serious option for him or her to appropriate Otto's phenomenology of the holy. Now, somebody might say on behalf of Otto, well, look, maybe here we're transgressing in mooting this objection. We're transgressing upon Otto's sort of phenomenological neutrality. We're treating the holy as a specific object, the numen as a particular or a specific object. And remember that the whole point of the Es spukt hier observations that I just summarized earlier in the lecture, the whole point of that is that Otto doesn't want to treat the holy as anything specific or as an object or anything like that. So does the objection somehow trade in the kind of substantive assumptions about the nature of the holy, and so does it somehow objectionally reify it in a way that Otto wants to avoid, given the phenomenological influence upon him that comes from Husserl? Now, I think two things can be said, though. That's an interesting observation, but I don't think it goes far enough. Why? First of all, within Husserl's framework, which we saw Otto is taking over, the objectivity in any intentional experience is very, very neutral, or it's very non-committal itself. To say that an experience is intentional is simply to say that it purports to be directed at something other than itself, something out there. That something out there could be a particular object or a being, but it could just be some kind of a condition or something that's not a being, but is at least purports to be real. It could be something that seems to be out there, something seemingly out there. And without getting into the specifics or metaphysical or ontological specifics about what that is, that seems to be built in to any intentional experience, and it doesn't seem to have any particular metaphysical commitment in and of itself. We're simply making the observation that a holy experience, like other certain experiences, purports to be of something seemingly out there. Now, once we make that observation, the ontological antinomy, the challenge or the problem with Otto's phenomenology that we just described, that can still be stated, because the question remains, why is it that we experience only one something that seems to be out there, one holy something that seems to be out there, which sometimes appears to us under the aspect of mysterium tremendum, and at other times appears to us under the aspect of mysterium fascinans? Why is it, why isn't it that there are two holy somethings out there, two somethings that are holy that seem to be out there, one of which has the attribute of mysterium tremendum, and the other of which has the attribute of mysterium fascinans? Why aren't there two somethings seemingly out there that are different holies, as opposed to only one something seemingly out there that is the holy? We still don't really have an answer to that. Now, Otto himself does say something in connection with this objection that's a possible reply. And I want to read that passage so that we can discuss it or concentrate on it. He says this, and he suggests a certain reply in the following passage. He says, the fascinans, the attracting and alluring moment of the numinous, is schematized by the ideas of goodness, mercy, love, and so schematized becomes all that we mean by grace, that term so rich in import, which unites with the holy wrath, which is the tremendum schematized by the ideas of justice, moral will, and the exclusion of immorality, in a single harmony of contrasts, and like it is from the numinous strain in it tinged with mysticism. So what Otto is suggesting here is that there's a kind of harmony of contrasts, that the mysterium tremendum and the mysterium fascinans, they sort of fit together as contrasts, and that this harmony of contrast constitutes a unified phenomenon. And so on his behalf, in responding to the objection, someone might suggest, well, look, that's exactly what happens. That's why we have only one phenomenon of the holy with these two complementary aspects of mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans, as opposed to two holies, each of which with one of those respective attributes. Nevertheless, I don't think that that's enough. Why? Because let's think about the example or the idea of there being a harmony of contrasts. There are many phenomena or experiences that we have in which there are a harmony of contrasts, where the contrasting things are nevertheless ontologically distinct. Let me give you an example. We might have an experience on a beautiful winter day of the entire scene before us is consisting of the pure whiteness of the snow on the mountainside before us, and then that just beautifully, very clear blue sky over it. And certainly there would be quite a stark contrast between the whiteness of the snow and the blueness of the sky, and there's a kind of harmonious relationship there. Nevertheless, the snow is not the sky. Those two things are entirely distinct. They're ontologically distinct. And so that would indicate that the presence of a harmony of contrasts by itself does not preclude the possibility that what's contrasted there are really two ontologically distinct beings, or things, or objects, or somethings out there. And so the same thing could be true of the holy. Yes, maybe there is a harmony of contrasts, arguably, let's say for the sake of argument, between mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans as these two aspects. But why do they pertain to the same thing? They could be characteristics of ontologically distinct things, or realities, or somethings out there, things which are no less distinct from one another than the snow and the sky in the example that I just gave. And indeed, one might say, well, look, it's even a better harmony of contrast if these two things are ontologically distinct, because there you have a harmony, but then the things that harmonize are distinct from one another ontologically, and so that's an even greater harmony of contrasts. The bottom line here is that Otto himself, despite suggesting an interesting reply to the ontological antinomy, does not really solve it. And so we're left where we started, That is, unless we have some way of precluding the possibility that there are two holy noumena with the respective holy noumenal attributes, as opposed to only one holy noumen with possessing both of them, unless we can rule out this kind of ontological duality, then Otto's phenomenology of the holy is really not available to us yet. We need to work through this and figure out how we would answer or to head off this ontological antinomy. Now, the last thing that I want to do today is point towards what I think might be a possible resource for this time helping Otto answer that question. Let me go back to Otto's work and just read another passage that I think is very interesting and that points towards at least a resource we can use for addressing and overcoming the ontological antinomy. Otto, in his phenomenology, wants to embrace an anti-genealogical account of the holy. What do I mean by that? He doesn't want to see our experience of the holy as somehow developing or growing out of more primitive experiences. He thinks that our experience of the holy is something sui generis, it's something entirely autonomous. It doesn't evolve or develop out of something else. He says, it is not that the actual feeling gradually changes in quality or evolves into a quite different one, but rather that I pass over or make the transition from one feeling to another as my circumstances change by the gradual decrease of the one and increase of the other. So he means the holy is not something where we have some kind of non-religious experience that somehow is worked up into an experience of the holy. The experience of the holy sort of comes all by itself. There may be other things, experiences that we have, but they're totally non-religious prior to that. But then when we have this experience of the holy, it is categorically different from anything that came before it, and so it cannot evolve from that. So that's an anti-genealogical conception of the holy noumen, or of the holy as the intentional object of our numinous experiences of the holy. Now, how does that help us, or what does that point towards? Well, what I find interesting here, and I discussed this in my book some more, is that Ludwig Wittgenstein has a very similar anti-genealogical account of what he calls the sinister. And this account can be found in a collection of notes that were published under the name Remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough. I think this is available in Philosophical Occasions, which are some incidental writings of Wittgenstein that were gathered into this volume. And so here, Wittgenstein is discussing the Beltane fire festivals. And these are some practices in, I believe when Fraser was writing about them, James Fraser in his great book, The Golden Bough, these were some practices or rituals that were occurring in the 19th century, in the British Isles during the 19th century, and I think that they still do occur. It's sort of like an early version of the Burning Man festival, if you will. And here, people in these latter-day festivals would pretend to burn a human being alive. They would go through the motions and pretend that they were burning a human being at the stake or throwing the person into the fire. Now, Wittgenstein says in his discussion of the Beltane fire festivals, he says that these festivals have a kind of sinister character to us. They're disturbing. There's something unsettling about them. And he wants to say that this sinister character that the Beltane festival has, and that similar festivals have, is not something, it can't be traced back to the fact that, well, at some time in the distant past, in the haze and murk of our history, many, many years ago, centuries ago perhaps, there was actual human sacrifice, and that there's a causal chain from that up to the current festival, so that somehow the sinister character of the festival is derived from the sinister character of the original sacrificial event back in the mists of human history. Wittgenstein, whether he's right or not, attributes that kind of genealogical view to Fraser, James Fraser, and Wittgenstein rejects it. He thinks that whatever explains the sinister character of the festival, the Beltane festival itself, that's something that itself is sui generis. that is something that is autonomous and doesn't have anything to do with there being some connection, historical connection to an actual rite of human sacrifice back in the past. Now, that sounds very similar to what Otto says about the holy. So that's what I mean when I say that Wittgenstein, in his discussions of the sinister, and we're going to look at some other things that he discusses in the next lecture, here we might be able to find in Wittgenstein's writings, some of them at least, resources or tools that will help us to overcome the ontological antinomy that threatens to hamstring and undermine Otto's phenomenology of the holy, or at least threatens to prevent us as Christian theologians seeking to develop a Heideggerian Gelassenheit theological option that would prevent us from appropriating Otto's work because it doesn't rule out the possibility of Manichaeanism. That's all for today. Next time we will look at Wittgenstein's works and begin to see where there are certain points that he makes within some of these writings, including his remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough, that will help us to address the ontological antinomy and Otto, and so to continue to carry forward our project of developing a Gelassenheit theology. But that's all for today. Thank you for joining me. Again, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. You may leave them on my YouTube channel, and I will do my best to answer them. I look forward to talking to you more about these very interesting questions next time. This is Dr. Peter Dillard signing off for Black Cat Theology. Thank you.